Hello, everyone. I'm Randall Mendenhall alongside Brandon LaBelle on location at the Range Systems Studio. Our featured speaker today is Brandon LaBelle, International Government and Law Enforcement Sales Representative here at Range Systems. Brandon has a firearms instruction background and brings years of military law enforcement experience to the table. Brandon's topic today is about how to advance law enforcement training with tactical sidewalls. Brandon, thank you for joining today.
Thanks. Good to be here. Excited to get into the topic and the subject matter, and hopefully we can get some good questions later on.
All right, before we start, I do want everyone to be aware that when we're talking about tactical sidewalls for the purposes of today's webinar, we're really only referring to the ballistic rubber used here at Range Systems. And it really is an important question to ask any shooting range provider that you're engaged with. You want to make sure that the materials that you're using are of good quality, have been tested, have a track record of being used with elite customers. So I just want everybody to know that we're really only referring to Range Systems ballistic rubber for today's webinar. All right, Brandon. So this is sometimes a problem for law enforcement management, and really the question is, or the situation is, my officers need real life movement. What can you tell us about that?
Well, oftentimes I get a lot of calls and emails here in the office from law enforcement and different departments all over the world, actually. And one of their largest problems, I'd say a majority of them have a problem with having the ability to train off the mark with their officers. Being able to go multi-fire, like live fire, multi-directional, and being able to engage their targets and prepare for real-world scenarios. Basically the encounters that our law enforcement officers experience on a day-to-day basis don't happen, in a straight line at 15 yards and 20 yards down the range. Everything, for a majority of the time, it happens within a couple feet, which what we call in retention range.
Awesome. And just so the audience knows here, this really isn't a training webinar. We're instead going to be talking about the equipment. And I put a screenshot here today actually from 2008. As a company, we realized that better training saves lives and really helps develop that competency of the law enforcement officers, and we want you to come home safely. And I say that because here you can see our snapshot from 2008 catalog where we specifically spelled that out. So we just want you all to know that we do want you to come home safely. All right, so Brandon, as you mentioned, traditionally it's fixed position training. What can you tell us about how that looks?
Well, most departments within the United States, anyway, their officers need to qualify once or twice a year. Of course, this is, it varies from department to department, state to state, but we find that most departments need to qualify once or twice a year, which would be a minimum requirement. Officers are, expected to take it upon themselves to do more training and be as well trained as possible, but being minimum requirements, this could really mean that each individual officer may only be shooting 30 to 50 rounds per year. And we think that most officers would agree that's just not sufficient for actual scenario to be proficient at being able to employ those tactics in real world scenarios. As mentioned before, real life just doesn't happen in one direction.
That's a very good point. Okay, so with that, what can you tell us about the multi-directional live fire training?
Well, having the ability to move in multi directions allows the officers to train the way they actually engage suspects in real life scenarios. You know, in the picture here, you can see that's me in our live fire tactical range. Is actually last week we had some veterans in that we were taking through some courses of fire and having a good time doing some training there. Being able to actually train in these types of scenarios, utilizing these movements, it encourages the proficiency of your officers, right? They get to actually train the way they actually move out there on the job. You know, it can be, as Randall's there highlighting, applied in real life situations. And I think, you know, it just makes no sense to train in a way that you don't actually perform. So, you know, what we're really emphasizing is being able to get off the mark, stop being stationary, and, you know, as mentioned before in one of the previous slides, most officers would agree that that is what needs to happen. You need to be able to move. It really doesn't make as much sense to just stand there and shoot at a target 20 yards away.
All right, so we've established really the benefits of this multi-directional live fire training. Well, what's stopping officers from stepping forward and being allowed to do that training?
Well, for the most part, it's going to be safety. It's all safety related. So, you know, you've got, depending on the, you know, multiple types of bullet traps that are out there, and in multiple facilities, just the variety of everything. Every department's different, you know, and really, you know, nearly every range looks different. You all have the same type. We've got a bullet trap down there at the end, and we've got a position, a firing line to shoot from. Well, going forward of that firing line, you have the danger of ricochet. You have the danger of back splatter. You've got shooters behind you, you know, potentially. You don't, you know, any competent RSO isn't going to allow that to happen. But I mean, what we're talking about, driving the point home that safety is the issue, and the lack of multi-direction live fire training. You know, say you have a department that all of a sudden has the ability to step forward to the firing line. Well, if they've never done it before, then they're not trained to do it. So there's, you know, you need to have the trainers on staff to be able to train these officers right, so everybody is comfortable with the movements and utilizing that whole space to its optimal potential.
All right. Well, if we asked many law enforcement agencies what they would like, ideally, many would say, hey, we'd love a full shoot house. We'd love having that large facility with lots of rooms in it to you know, to do all the advanced stuff. And, you know, what would some of the things that they'd be able to do if they had a shoot house? What would some of those be?
Oh, no doubt. If I'm getting the, you know, whoever's in charge of the department range calling me up on the phone, if they were to show me their Amazon wish list, it would be right at the top would be a, you know, multi-level shoot house for their department to be able to get in there and train their officers. And you know what the shoot house is offering, you know, wide range of training applications. So you've got the room clearing, you got breaching potentials, you know, and you get into the breaching and things like that. So that's more of a SWAT type application. But the rooms and multi-levels, that's what officers encounter every day. You know, being able to have that live fire training ability is just incredibly valuable. However, you know, the shoot houses are significantly more expensive than you know, some tactical sidewalls. A lot of times these departments calling me up, they already have an existing range. So when you hear the price tag attached to a shoot house, yeah, most departments don't have that in their budget to cover. So what may be a less expensive option is to go with tactical sidewalls in the existing range they already have, or a range that they're planning to build.
Excellent. Yeah, a full shoot house really is a marvelous facility. However, again, as you emphasize there, it's very budget driven and a significant investment. So the low-cost alternative would be some tactical sidewalls. What exactly are tactical sidewalls?
So basically, the application of a tactical sidewall system within a shooting range is being able to ballistically protect the sidewalls and having the shootability of 270 degrees within that facility. So this can be applied indoor or outdoor. You know, that you want to be able to shoot in various directions. That's, you know, that's the point of multi-directional, obviously. Being able to move one shooter at a time, you can have multiple shooters at a time, whatever that trainer and RSO is comfortable with. You're not limited anymore by your ability to move. And that's the point. There's zero, I won't say zero potential of ricochet, that's not proper, but virtually eliminates any ricochet or backsplatter. So, you know, up to, you know, from point blank to as far back as you want to move. It really allows the officers to be able to train in that retention range we were talking about earlier, as, you know, that area around them where they're actually dealing with people in potential suspects on a day-to-day basis.
And Brandon, why don't you just point out a couple of the components that we're looking at here in this picture for our audience?
So if you look in the picture there, you can see we've got a granular rubber trap there. So we've got 18 inches of depth minimum there of granular rubber. Behind that's going to be angled mild steel. The sidewall there to the right of the range. Now that sidewall goes all the way back to the shooters. That may not necessarily be all ballistic. You know, it really doesn't make sense to do 50 yards cost-wise, 50 yards on each side of steel, you know, ballistic steel and our ballistic rubber. Most departments and military that we talk to they go forward with building some tactical sidewalls. They'll go about 20 feet out from the trap. Saves on cost and gives them that 270 degrees of multi-directional live fire ability.
And you see here the ridges on the DuraPanel here. What's that all about?
So that's our acoustic DuraPanel. It's actually an acoustic molding for the panel itself. So it doesn't take away from the round capacity of our original DuraPanel. It's actually in addition to our original DuraPanel. So same round capacity, and another bonus to that is you're not charged any extra for it. It does significantly dampen the sound, especially within a lot of these ranges. If they happen to be in a basement, you know, there's a lot of concrete or potentially steel around, and you know, the sound waves just bounce off of that concrete and steel, and you know, can be really distracting. You can sometimes even feel the concussion when you're engaging. It can be really taxing on the trainers and the shooters themselves after being in the range for a whole day.
I think that's a very good point there. You want people to be comfortable so that that training experience is positive. And as you mentioned, you can do the sidewalls, you know, 20 feet off of the bullet trap, or you can go all the way down the entire length. Really, that's a cost question, correct?
Well, it's a question not only on cost, but you know, we look at the big picture of how does this department want to train? You know, is this a range that they want to bring a vehicle into? In that case, well, maybe they need a little bit more than 20 feet. You know, it's really, there are very little limitations and a wide variety of options. So you're really only limited by your imagination when it comes to this type of application to your range.
Well, we've defined what tactical sidewalls are. Now let's continue going into the topic with how they can be applied. What can you tell the audience about that?
Well, they're commonly installed in new ranges. So, you know, when you have the the build plans. We would work with your existing architect or engineer, or city planners, whoever's doing the development of the construction of the range, and make sure we get those in there into the process. However, that doesn't exclude existing ranges. Basically, the components we need is a sidewall that you can attach a ballistic steel to, and the ability to put our ballistic rubber right on top of that steel.
All right, and it looks like you can also use this in situations where you do have a steel bullet trap. Here we have shown a rubber granular bullet trap, but say you did have a steel bullet trap, how would that work for some of our listeners today who may have that in their existing law enforcement range?
Right. It's obviously extremely expensive to go and rip out your steel bullet trap that you probably already paid a lot of money for. So it's not optimal for the 270-degree ability of multi-directional fire. So in this particular case, a sidewall would be utilized primarily for that live fire multi-directional use. You wouldn't necessarily use it in conjunction with the steel trap, just because you're not able to engage that steel trap from point blank range or multi-directions. Those steel traps they're designed to take just a ton of abuse, but a ton of abuse from a fixed position downrange. So in that case, we'd build out that sidewall. You would build out that sidewall, put the rubber where you need it, where you want your people to train from, and you would utilize the sidewall only.
Yep, so they'd be focused really on that. If this were to be a steel bullet trap, they would just be focusing that type of training on the wall itself, right? Correct? They'd engage the wall. Okay, well, we're going to shift gears here. We've defined what the tactical sidewalls are. We've talked about how they can be applied. Now we're going to talk about the common questions that most range providers should be asked or that they receive when they're working with customers who are looking at something like this. So here are some of the 5 most common questions to ask for your range provider. Why don't you walk us through those, Brandon? What should we know about this?
We'll start from the top there. How much room do I need? Well, as I mentioned before, you're only really limited on your imagination. Now, you need to be practical, and that's not for me to decide for you. That's for your training crew to decide. You obviously need enough room for your officers to move, right, and engage in a practical manner. So, I would suggest, a minimum of, the bay of the range be a minimum of 15 to 20 feet. And that's obviously on the smaller side. And it can be as large as you need it to be. Now, moving on to the next question there, how high do my ceilings need to be? Again, it's a practical usage here. You can look in this picture. This is in our live fire tactical range here at our headquarters, and you can see the ceiling there is pretty low. It's probably about 8.5 feet, right? And we've got steel and rubber on the ceiling there, and we've got you can see the light guards that hang down. There's literally nowhere in that range that you can't shoot a bullet. And we obviously did that for a purpose. That it's for a demonstration range. And this isn't something, if we had all the room in the world, we wouldn't build it out like this. We want higher ceilings, we want a wider range. But in this case, it really showcases how small you can make this range and make something totally tactical and operational and just fully effective for your officers to get in and do this multi-directional training.
All right, so you talked about the size, how much room do I need, and then you touched on how high the ceilings need to be. When it comes to engagement, again, we're talking about range systems, ballistic rubber, but generally, how does that work?
So with the Dura panel, you see there on the walls, or our Dura block, which well, I'm sure we have another picture of this later on, but you've got 2 inches in reference to the Dura panel that's on this wall here, 2 inches of ballistic rubber and ballistic steel behind it. So the important thing to remember with any ballistic rubber is that the ballistic rubber isn't what's stopping the bullet, right? The ballistic steel is stopping the bullet. And I say this because it's a question we get all the time. You know, how deep does it need to be to stop a 50 cal? Well, it's not, you know, it's not the rubber that's stopping it. It's the ballistic steel. So the rubber, its primary purpose is to prevent ricochet and any backsplatter. So for this 2 inches of ballistic rubber that you see here in the picture, shooter can engage that from point blank range, muzzle on the rubber, pulling the trigger, and have virtually no chance for any type of ricochet or backsplatter. Now, I'll tell you what does happen if you put the muzzle right up to the rubber. Well, you're going to get some blowback. Obviously, gases need to expand. They have to go somewhere, right? So you get a little bit more recoil. Normally, in that type of application, you're doing some type of muzzle blast or something like that, where you're actually striking your target with the muzzle and shooting at the same time. Again, it's if that's a tactic that wants to be employed by the trainer, then they have that option, and that's why we have this ballistic rubber that's the quality so high that you can shoot at it from point blank. And then again, you can engage it from as far back as you need to.
All right, so we've talked about engagement distance. Now let's talk a little bit about the lifespan of tactical sidewalls. So if somebody puts these in, what, you know, how long does it last? You know, does that depend on volume? Does that depend on use? What can you tell the audience about that?
Well, it definitely depends on the use. So, you know, again, we'll reference this picture since we've got it in front of us. Each panel there that you see on the wall, 2 inches deep, it's 2 feet wide by 2 feet high. Each one of those Dura panels, you can get around 2,000 rounds in it, even disbursement throughout the panel before it requires replacement. Now, our Dura blocks, you know, they're 12 inches deep, 9 inches high, 24 inches wide. You're getting about 5,000 rounds before that Dura block requires replacement. So significantly more volume. And that's generally where you know, you have high target. Obviously, while shooting and engaging a target, your objective normally is to try to hit the same spot, right? Pretty sure we can all agree on that. So if you have certain areas that are going to be high targeted, we've got options for you like that. You can use the tactical sidewall here with the Dura panel in conjunction with our Dura block, just to get more volume out of the square footage. So which brings us to our next question, right? And it's what everybody always wonders: how much does it cost? Well, it's obviously going to vary on what you need. Do you need the Dura blocks and the Dura panels and along with the steel? Okay, well, in that case, we do, you know, there'd be, we'd have to price everything individually. You know, when it comes to steel application with the, you know, for the sake of the webinar here, just for the tactical sidewalls themselves, you're looking between, if we were to do a square footage price, since that's more simple, you're looking between about $38.50 to $40 per square foot. This is just ballpark figures here. You know, if you're doing it without steel, rubber, and adhesive only, you're probably coming in around $14 per square foot. So and again, those are ballpark figures. If you're, whatever range consultant you may be dealing with, will be able to map out your facility and give you hard numbers once you get to that point. But those are good enough numbers to where you can wrap your head around getting a ballpark figure. If you were to build 20 feet out from your bullet trap that you have currently, and or if you need whether you need just rubber coverage or if you need steel and rubber.
Good questions. Those are really good questions, and certainly ones to ask any of your shooting range providers that you may be having discussions with. And Brandon, you had just mentioned shooting range consultants. At this time, I'd like to share with the audience some additional resources that are available. First is the National Shooting Sports Foundation website. If you've been on any of our previous webinars, I always like to share with the audience this website because it's so good. It's a good source of information. It's an industry site for the Firearms Industry Trade Association. And on that website, under the ranges section, you'll find a roster of shooting range providers as well as consultants. And those consultants typically have ranges of their own, and they can, they're a really good source of information and can help guide you through your process as you go through and explore and look at different options and really what's ultimately best for your needs and budget. It also has industry information on that website. And then lastly, here at Range Systems, we do have a range design guide where we've really went in depth on the components of a range, what's included, how they all fit together. And again, we emphasize the importance of mapping your equipment selection to your needs. All right, next, I'd like to just cover our key takeaways. To summarize today's webinar, Brandon, what would you say the key takeaways are?
Well, I mean, if you have the idea that, which I think we covered, most officers already have that need, that requirement to be able to get off the mark and have multi-directional live fire training ability. So first thing you want to do is get a hold of a shooting range provider, and get in touch with their range designer as soon as possible. A lot of times these projects take, they take 12 to 18 months, depending on budgetary restrictions and any number of elements that can come into play and kind of throw a wrench into things. But the sooner you can get in touch with the range provider and start that conversation, and you can start talking about numbers, and like I said, you're only limited by your imagination on how you can design your range to be better effective utilizing the tactical sidewalls. Being able to have that realistic training, I think everybody can agree, the better trained your officers are, the safer they're going to be, the more confident they're going to be in their ability to perform their job on a day-to-day basis. The importance of that is just being able to engage the tactical sidewalls from point blank to as far back as you need to. It's just there's just so many different uses for it. So, I think we've covered that pretty thoroughly through the webinar here. The next thing down on the line here is the commonly applied in shooting ranges. So, again, going back to one of our very first slides is with the shoot houses. So if you already have a current range, you're not restricted by any means. Right? You have the ability to get in there, put some tactical sidewalls up, and train nearly the same way you could with a shoot house on a much smaller budget. All right. So if you have multiple bays, some of these existing ranges, you may have a bay for long guns, a bay for handguns. Well, you can make just one of those bays. You can make all those bays. You're only limited on you know, what your budget is going to be able to do for you. A lot of times, you know, a department will take one bay and just make that their tactical bay, and that makes a lot of sense depending on the size of it. So, like I said, you're only really restricted on your imagination how to apply this tactical sidewall system.
Well, this concludes the content portion of our webinar. We're now going to be switching into the Q&A part. So let's get started with our questions here. Looks like we have a question from David. David asks, what percentage of tactical sidewalls are applied to existing ranges? I know we touched on the ability of that to happen. Brandon, when you're talking with customers, you know, do you see this commonly? How does that usually shake out?
You know, I don't have an exact percentage, but I would say it's going to be higher percentage. You have, you know, in our recent years, you know, we have a lot of veterans and maybe retired law enforcement that are you know, wanting to build their own ranges. And you know, depending on what state and county you may live in, sometimes because departments don't have their own range, they'll rent out time at certain ranges from private owners. So the application of these tactical sidewalls is becoming more and more common every day, to be able to employ that type of multi-directional live fire training.
All right, our next question comes from William, and I'm actually going to flip back a few slides here for William's question. William asks, how often do you encounter the need for strengthening the walls before applying the tactical sidewalls with existing buildings? And so I flip back to a slide here that actually shows a hot wall. So Brandon, what can you tell us about how often you encounter the need for strengthening walls, and maybe just talk a little bit more about you know, some of the wall options there?
Well, I mean, strengthening the existing wall, it's preferred that it is a concrete wall, you know, either a poured concrete or a filled CMU, and you know, once we put that ballistic steel on there, you've got the ballistic ability. So what we use is a 3/8 inch ballistic steel with our DuraPanel protective coverage at that time. So if you see the picture here, if you go beyond me, we've got the standard tactical sidewall. Again, this is in our full tactical range here at our headquarters, and we have it set up just for demonstration purposes. So this may not necessarily be the way you in your department uses it for your training application, but we have there as an example as we bring visitors into the range here to show the ability of our DuraBlock application on the tactical sidewall. So as I mentioned earlier in the webinar, each block there is getting around 5,000 rounds of for full capacity before it needs to be changed. So that wall there, I'm thinking we're probably 4 blocks wide, and not sure how high we are there, but as I'm trying to do the math, we're getting hundreds of thousands of rounds just in this portion of the wall before full a full renovation of the rubber would be required. So you're getting, you know, a significant number of rounds to train with before you even need to have replacement rubber on hand. And again, back to the DuraPanels, which would be on either side of that that block wall, you get about 2,000 rounds per panel. So it all comes down to how you want to train, how often you want to train, and you know, the area of coverage you really want to engage.
And you can see here how the targets then are arranged so that the trainer keeps kind of moving the bullseye, so to speak, as you set up for different events and different training scenarios. Correct?
Correct. And we do that for a number of reasons, but one being that when you have an area that gets a lot of traffic, what I mean by that is obviously more rounds than the rest. Mostly you're shooting center mass. That's what most trainers are training their officers to do. Is you get a lot of coverage in a smaller area. Well, that may only cover 1 or 2 blocks. So basically, you can break that wall down like Legos or Lincoln Logs or Tetris. Fill in your favorite game of choice.
Yeah.
It's I call it the adult version of Legos, and each of these blocks is 80 pounds. So by no means is it easy, but yes, one person can do it on their own. So basically, you break down that wall to get to that high traffic area. You pull those blocks out. You put a block from a less traffic area, an area that's just not getting as many rounds, probably virtually looks untouched. Well, you throw that bad boy into the area that you just pulled the full blocks from, and you can put those full blocks in that area where there's less traffic. That's the way to be able to use the entire space and really extend your time before you need to be purchasing more ballistic rubber.
And so you had mentioned here onto the sides of the wall there, you have DuraPanel that's attached to the steel with adhesive, correct?
Correct. So you use an adhesive that allows the panel to stick to the steel. So you need a nice clean surface on the steel before it's applied. Again, it's very simple to do. This is anybody who can apply adhesive and stick something to steel has the ability to do it. If you need be, there's install crews that can do it for you. What I've found is a lot of departments, they need their officers doing what they're supposed to be doing out on the road and not building out their facility. So there's other options for it, but it's not a difficult task. I think most ranges that I find they assign 1 or 2 people that they're in charge of the maintenance, and then that's where their duties would fall in there with the replacement of the rubber. But basically, to cover how the panel would be changed out, then you get about 2,000 rounds. You're going to notice that it has what we call a sort of a pregnant look. It's bulging, so it's gonna belly out from the wall, and basically what's going to be holding that panel on is just the adhesive on the edges, right? So with a crowbar, you'll be able to work free the edges, and that lead will fall to the ground. You can gather that lead, recycle it, do what you will with it at that point, and then clean the surface and apply that new panel.
All right, our next question comes from Stephen. Stephen asks, can a sidewall be constructed of just ballistic steel? If so, what thickness does the steel need to be, and what are the caliber restrictions?
Thanks for the question, Stephen. See if I'm getting it right. You just want steel without ballistic rubber. The easy answer to that is no, and I'll say no because there's no safe application for it at that point without ballistic rubber on it. It would be the same reason why you're not going to engage a steel trap from point blank range, is because you have that ricochet potential and that backsplash potential. So you can, as a department, construct. Now this is what I think you mean, but I could be wrong. If you already have your steel, say you're sourcing steel from a local supplier, and if this is what you mean, that you did it on your own and you already have your steel walls, then yes, absolutely, You can purchase ballistic rubber to cover that surface area, and do it yourself. That's many departments choose to do that. You know, it makes sense. You know, if maybe you have a big steel supplier right in town, well, then you're not paying crazy shipping costs to get the materials there. So it makes sense, so the answer to that question would be yes. The answer to the question as it was worded, as I interpreted it first off, would be no. You don't want to engage bare steel.
Yeah, and Stephen did follow up there, yes, with the ballistic rubber on top. So
Okay.
what would the thickness of that steel, that AR-500 steel that is put behind the rubber? What thickness does that need to be, and what are the caliber restrictions for that?
So that you want a minimum of a 3/8 inch AR-500 steel. Okay. At that point, you're getting up to a 7.62, which would be a 300 Winchester, right? So, or 308, excuse me. So if you want to go beyond that, you bulk up to 1/2 inch, which is a pretty large increase at that time, and pretty significant. Again, you're focusing on stopping the round. So those, you know, the reason we do the 3/8 inch for the 7.62 is because it's what most military and law enforcement officers are using. Normally, unless you've got sniper training, they're not really moving into anything higher than that. And again, that covers all of the handgun rounds up to Magnum, so like a 357 or a 44 Magnum. You just really want to make sure you get that quality steel. In that, you know, in respect to that question, just because you have a steel mill in town or close by doesn't necessarily mean that they have the ability to make the ballistic steel. So really check into that, and check with your range provider on what those regulations may be, and what components need to come together to make sure that steel is ballistic.
All right, great question there, Stephen. Our next question, and I'm not sure if this is a question that we can answer here. Don asks about disposing of the rubber block when the block reaches the end of the life. I know in our previous webinar we had talked about lead disposal companies. So Brandon, is that really a question for them, taking care of that?
Well, it's not a question I can answer, but it is a question I can help guide you with. It is, obviously, you shoot into something, anything that you shoot into and you need to get rid of it, that's going to be a question. Now, how do I get rid of it? To answer that question, the lead disposal laws are different in every county of every state. So that would be something you check within your region to find out how you need to dispose of it. What we find is the most effective method, and this probably justifies doing a webinar specific to this later on, is getting with the lead management company. There are companies that exist out here that stay plenty busy out there, just going around the country cleaning these ranges. And to give you just a short example of that, you have a need for your range to be cleaned. Well, what they would do is come in, they would clean your range, and first do an assessment, decide how much more ballistic rubber you need. They would get with a rubber provider, get that rubber, come in, clean your range, dispose of all of the product that needs to be disposed of, recycle any lead that may need to be recycled or that can be recycled, and they'll resell it, excuse me. And common times that's what they'll take, the sum of what they get for that cost of the lead off your bill. So it ends up being a very cost-effective way to recycle it. And then you know, the major thing is that you don't have the headache yourself of having to figure out how to dispose it.
Great question, Don. certainly there are resources available then for people looking for that information. All right, that concludes the Q&A section of our webinar. I'd like to just say thank you to everyone who joined in our audience today, and also thank you to you, Brandon, for presenting on how to advance law enforcement training with tactical sidewalls.
It's a pleasure.
We hope this was valuable information for everybody in our audience. And lastly, our next webinar is coming up Thursday, November 16th, just before the week before Thanksgiving, where we will be talking about the classic question, rubber versus steel bullet traps. We're going to do a comparison, which is better. All right, that's it for us today. Thanks again to everyone who joined, and have a great day. We'll see you on the range.
Thanks, guys.